Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, Thomas J. Price in Conversation. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney, where we're so happy to be partnering with our sister institution, the Studio Museum in Harlem, to present this conversation with this beautiful, incredible group of artists and curators: Thomas J. Price, Allison Glenn, Kiyan Williams, Hugh Hayden, and Legacy Russell. Sorry, I didn't read that in order. Maybe I went too fast, but they'll introduce themselves. Thank you all for being here, you all on stage and you all in the audience and you all out in the world joining us on the internet. And thank you to everyone at the Studio Museum, especially the fantastic public programs team, Dayon, Melania, Maya, and Naomi. So I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to start by sharing some access information for tonight's program. Closed captioning is available for this event. If you're joining us virtually, you can enable the captioning feature by clicking on transcript option in Zoom. Thank you to Bonnie Rothermel at SignNexus for providing the captions. And thank you also to our ASL interpreters, Timothy Mills and Brandon Boyce from ProBono ASL. For those of you who are here with us in person tonight, restrooms are located outside of the theater on the 3rd floor. And if you need to exit the program for any reason, please use the doors at the back of the room where you entered. So tonight's conversation has been convened in conjunction with the exhibition Thomas J. Price Witness, curated by Legacy Russell. And tonight's discussion, as I understand it, I hope I'm getting this right, takes Price's work as a starting point to consider monuments, iconography, and visual politics through a diasporic lens. These are themes that resonate with so much of our work here at the Whitney, most recently and publicly in the Monumental Art Project Days End by David Hammonds, that's situated just across the West Side Highway at the shoreline of the Hudson River, basically right behind this wall. It's a project that prompts us to reflect on the layers of history embedded in this place where we're all gathered. And with that in mind, I want to acknowledge that we're on Lenape land, in Lenapehoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people. The Whitney site is close to land that was an important Lenape fishing village and planting area called Sapocanicon. Today, the Lenape live in a diaspora across North America. And as a Museum of American Art in a city with a vital and diverse Indigenous community, the Whitney is committed to honoring the perspectives of Indigenous artists and communities as we all work for a more equitable future. If you're joining us online, I hope you'll take a moment to identify and recognize the Indigenous people who have always and continue to steward the land from where you're joining us. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dayon Huff, Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Studio Museum, to share more about tonight's program.
Good evening, all. A little shorter. Good evening. Good evening, all, and thank you so much to Megan, Andrew Hawks, and the entire Whitney production team running things tonight. And thank you all for joining us in person and virtually. My name is Jan Huff, and I'm Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Studio Museum, as Megan said. And on behalf of the Public Programs team of Melania Graham, Naomi Aminu-Fasea, Maya Weitz, and the entire Studio Museum community, we are so grateful for the partnership of the Whitney Museum of American Art in co-organizing and hosting today's program as we eagerly await the reopening of our museum home in Harlem. Tonight's program is the culmination of a multi-part program series called Conversations in the Commons in support of the Studio Museum's exhibition Thomas J. Price Witness, on view until this Saturday, October 1st, in Harlem's Marcus Garvey Park. I would like to acknowledge that Thomas J. Price Witness was made possible thanks to the Open Society Foundations, with additional support provided by Citi, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation's Frankenthaler Digital Initiative. The Conversations in the Commons program series sought to unpack some of the big themes of Price's work into presentations and conversations offered in digestible and intimate bites, including self-fashion, surveillance, monuments of public space, by tapping into the brilliant perspectives of academics, historians, activists, architects, poets, curators, artists, fashion influencers, as well as our expansive and insightful publics based in the US and the UK. And tonight's conversation will only amplify those explorations. Just as Megan grounded us in acknowledging this downtown land we are situated on, I'd like to offer you a different grounding of sorts, an offering of how prices work, an exploration of how the Black body exists within physical space, was itself witnessed as an uptown Harlem resident for the past year. I made a habit of taking daily walks to see him at the start of the exhibition. October 1st, the light before the light, when night still creeps, the street lights still on, dogs can frolic on the grass, unleashed, no one's watching, head focused on phone, I'm waiting at, see you soon, cricket sound last call. October 6th, park guardian, park watcher, park figure, new Harlem resident, a cousin from across the pond, eyes down, stands with back to parked cop car with flashing lights on the opposite end. October 7th, black squirrel bounds and weaves between the legs of the Black man. He pays no mind. October 8th, bald head, direct sun, bright spot, sunscreen please, don't want you to burn. October 30th, walking towards you, walked a man in front of me, black shades, black Nikes, black windbreaker pants, black hoodie, black man, facing you, Nikes, black, sweatpants, black, hoodie, black, cell, black, skin, black, man, black. Black is the color of my true love's hair. I haven't seen you. I haven't touched you. I haven't found you yet. So it's crazy to think how quickly time has passed because we're already at a year. And with that, it's now my great pleasure to offer you very abbreviated bios of tonight's incredibly dynamic cohort of speakers. Allison Glenn is a curator and writer deeply invested in working closely with artists to develop ideas, artworks, and exhibitions that respond to and transform our understanding of the world. Glenn's curatorial work focuses on the intersection of art and publics through public art, biennials, special projects, and major new commissions by leading contemporary artists. She is senior curator at New York's Public Art Fund. Recently, she received substantial critical and community praise for her curatorial work in the groundbreaking exhibition at the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, titled Promise, Witness, Remembrance, an exhibition that reflected on the life of Breonna Taylor and centered on her portrait painted by Amy Sherald. The New York Times selected the exhibition as one of the best art exhibitions of 2021. Hugh Hayden's practice considers the anthropomorphization of the natural world as a visceral lens for exploring the human condition. Hayden transforms familiar objects through a process of selection, carving, and juxtaposition to challenge our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the environment. Raised in Texas and trained as an architect, his work arises from a deep connection to nature and its organic materials. Hayden was born in Dallas, Texas in 1983 and lives and works in New York City. He holds an MFA from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University. Hugh Hayden is co-curator and participant artist of the Public Art Fund exhibition Black Atlantic on view at Brooklyn Bridge Park until November 27th, 2022. Kiyan Williams is a visual artist based in New York City, working fluidly across sculpture, video, performance, and installations. They create artworks that redefine fixed notions of the body, identity, and American history. They are attracted to quotidian, unconventional materials and methods that evoke the historical, political, and ecological forces that shape individual and collective bodies. Williams earned a BA with honors from Stanford University and an MFA in visual art from Columbia University. Williams' work is in private and public collections, including the Hirshhorn Museum and the Hammer Museum. Their work is also on view in Black Atlantic. Thomas J. Price's multidisciplinary practice confronts preconceived attitudes toward representation, perception, and identity. Price's large-scale sculptures depict imagined subjects whose features are an amalgamation of sources. Individuals from Price's lived experience, as well as stereotypes represented in the media, are mixed with references to ancient, classical, and neoclassical sculptures. Price refers to his fictional subjects as psychological portraits of the viewer, but at the center are expressions of humanity. Using methods of presentation, material, scale, and detail, Price aims to challenge viewers' expectations and assumptions. Born in London in 1981, Price studied at Chelsea College of Art and the Royal College of Art in London. Price was the recipient of the Art Council England Helen Chadwick Fellowship in 2009 and was commissioned to create a public artwork in Hackney in 2022 titled Warm Shores, commemorating the Windrush generation. And I just wanted to note that there will be time for a few questions post-conversation, and in the spirit of equal opportunity in this hybrid world we now live in, we'll be taking questions from both the in-person audiences as well as those joining us on Zoom. And now it's my great pleasure to hand things over to my dear colleague, Witnesses Curator, and tonight's moderator, Legacy Russell, who will speak more to the exhibition before opening the conversation up. Legacy, thank you.
It's a great honor to be here because we're in a moment where this week is really the last week of this very special show. And to introduce myself, my name is Legacy Russell. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator at The Kitchen. For those of you who have had the pleasure of visiting The Kitchen, it's only a short walk from here. It's an intersectional site of art and the avant-garde that's been defying discipline since 1971. But really I'm here today as a former curator at Studio Museum, right, with this immense community, thinking about Thomas J. Price's Witness, which of course has been on view now for nearly a year. And to kind of back up a little, because I think it's important to talk about, what is it that we're seeing? For those of you who've yet to visit the project, I hope that you'll get out there before the end of the week. And for those of you who have spent time with it, it's a 9-foot bronze figure titled The Distance Within, and it's sited in Harlem's Marcus Garvey Park. It depicts a young black man looking down at his cell phone. So the form of this piece actually pays homage to a work titled Network that the artist himself originally presented in the UK in 2013. And this is significant because, of course, Thomas has long been committed to this idea of what public looks like, and inside of the UK and its history, expanding this idea of the commons, which of course Diane has so thoughtfully set into motion in terms of her remarks just now. So these are sculptures that are inspired by real people. They are an amalgam of many folks that Thomas has known, right, and as well, right, oftentimes those who live and work inside of his hometown of South London, where he was born and raised and resides today. So it's, I think, an interesting thing to think about, right, having a black British artist enter Harlem, and why Harlem is a conversation that, I know that you and I, Tom, have had many discussions about. It's a special relationship. Tom has often referred to Harlem as a home away from home, thinking about his neighborhood of Brixton to where, of course, he describes Harlem as a counterpoint, which is really important, I think speaks to this idea of Harlem really as being this site that is refracted, right? It exists in many places, in many imaginations, and many folks internationally through their diasporas have a connection to Harlem as a site. So of course this holds a special significance, and I mention all of this because, to discuss this idea of black masculinity at a monumental scale through this sculpture is something that I think is challenging and sticky and beautiful and wonderful. It pushes us further to think about what public sculpture is supposed to do, right? It asks us to kind of consider and reframe the ways in which monumental public sculpture is, of course, always raced and classed and gendered. And then, of course, to Tom's words, right, he's mentioned, before that he wants to interrogate notions of presence, movement, and freedom, asking about who do these spaces, as in kind of public space, belong to, and what bodies are provided more or less autonomy to move with liberty through public space. So I set this into the framework for our conversation with our amazing panelists this evening. We've got on the stage, what I really feel, and with great delight, right, some of the most important folks who are thinking about this question of public in art right now. And, when we kind of conceived of this and thought about, how do we talk about this idea of presence and monument, right, it felt really important to look at that as a kind of 360 question. Certainly there is no single sight line, and it feels significant, right, to kind of think about this idea of liberty through and in public space. What does that mean? What does that even look like? So, to kind of see that intersection of liberty and public, of course, as the opportunity this evening is really exciting. And so, I maybe want to start with thinking through, each of your practices and the work, of course, that you have continued to do. Allison, of course, with you as a curator inside of this, right? So, of course, we are holding it down on the curatorial side here. And of course, with our three incredible artists that are on the stage with us, perhaps to begin by having each of you talk a little bit about this idea of form, right? Because I appreciate that you are all taking different positions on what that looks like. And while Tom, of course, is using bronze, which is its own complicated material, right? Kiyan, in your case, you have the opportunity to be thinking through this idea of monumental sculpture as really an opportunity to have the material itself be something that has a different level of fixity, right? So there's a really wide kind of range here in terms of how that exists. And then, of course, Hugh with your practice too, right? Thinking about what the natural world does, how that manifests, and what you're kind of doing and shaping that. So I'm wondering if maybe each of you can talk about your relationship to form. And to material. And maybe we start there with, what literally is being built with these different works.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And I'll love to get us started. So my piece, Ruins of Empire, is a 13-foot tall sculpture that is a recreation of the Statue of Freedom, which is a monument atop the U.S. Capitol building, a historic bronze that depicts a neoclassical female figure built in 1863. And in my sort of public art and sculptural practice, I'm really invested in challenging and subverting the conventions of a monumental sort of traditional practice. And so in my reimagining of this historic monument, I've rendered it in earth. So it's made primarily of earth that I model or mold around a steel and wood armature. And I'm really interested in sort of subverting or proposing a different relationship to time and to history, so such that my material translation suggests that time and history are malleable, can transform over time, as opposed to be a sort of rigid presence that imposes itself into public space.
Hugh, what about you?
I would say similarly, but also differently. I'm subverting other familiar forms. In the case of the Gulf Stream, which is the work I have in the Black Atlantic exhibition at Brooklyn Bridge Park, I'm taking something that's familiar in terms of materiality and form, a boat, but transforming the interior of it, that from a distance, while it's a static sculpture, as you walk towards it, it transforms into this sort of creature that has, where the structural system of the boat looks like it's the skeleton of a whale or some sort of large organism. And so that it's taking like a traditional form or material and sort of subverting it, making it uncanny, and transforming it to something else that surprises you, or it takes I would say my practice sort of often takes really benign or sort of things you might take for granted, objects or materials, and sort of transforms them into something that sort of, as an artist, I feel if I'm able to change the way you think about these simple shapes or materials from a pure visceral level, it's like a way in to transform the way you think more conceptually about the things that the piece is actually about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, Tom, I feel like that idea of transformation is something that you think about a lot as well with your work. Can you maybe speak to this idea of form and material and what it means to have things kind of shift within your working?
I think it's really interesting in terms of the idea of subversion, and so that we all seem to be subverting this idea of the monument. Mm-hmm. And I think, so although the works that we're talking about and are up on the screen at the moment are all in bronze, I actually started using different materials. So my first piece was actually, it's a subversion in terms of scale, which has always been a part of my practice. as well as material. So I used plaster instead of marble. And I did a very small sculpture which went low down the wall. It was a made-up fictional character, so that it wasn't about individual excellence. It wasn't about these great leaders, from history, who we should worship, continuing into the future. So when I changed the form, or the form developed using bronze, it was a conscious decision in terms of engaging with the same material and then working my way towards the same scale as the images of these great figures, that we were supposed to, really look up to, literally, in terms of being on plinths. So, my figures don't even go on plinths. It's about being grounded with them so that we have a different relationship between ourselves and the figures manifested, so that we start to look at what we've had in the past, so that we can kind of decide where we're going to go in the future.
And I think the thing about to the point of it not being on a plinth, it is actually quite a challenge from a design perspective to have these major sculptures actually exist as they sit on the ground. In the case of obviously, this 9-foot sculpture that's in Mark Discovery Park, there was a lot of discussion about how to make that possible, and of course, to kind of grow towards that as well being something that shifts our viewership, right? Having something that maybe we don't look at it eye to eye, but quite frankly, the amount of people I've seen hug this sculpture has been extraordinary, right? And I think that in itself does the work, because it's an opportunity to see that people are not set apart, or sort of are unafraid, right, of what it means to have these monumental sculptures become ordinary. They are on the ground with us, they are living with us, right? What does that look like? So Allison, I'm curious, because of your new position, the newish, right? We were so excited to see you at the Public Art Fund. And thinking about this idea of public as being something that really has so many applications. So I'm wondering, from a curatorial perspective, if you can talk about, what does it mean to think about expanding public and maybe redefining what that could look like?
That's a great question, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak with these incredible artists and you. What's been really exciting for me working with the team at Public Art Fund and thinking about publics and audiences is that the organization's been doing this for 45 years and has had really deep engagements with a largely accidental, multi-generational audience. Oftentimes with public art, the people that are visiting don't have intention to visit. I mean, of course there's viewership, but the beautiful thing about having sculpture in public space, or a public work in public space, whatever manifestation that is, sculpture or something else, is that there are very limited barriers to entry, almost none, including having Thomas's work not on a plinth, and also these works installed right on the ground.
Exactly.
So there's a little bit more access. And so what's really exciting to me is opportunity, and the opportunity to think about the multiple audiences and publics across New York City and what's possible to engage with.
Yeah, I think it was amazing, obviously, to see, as the pandemic entered into its form in March of 2020, that actually it was public sculpture that stayed in the world. And Kiyan, of course, as we continued to follow your immense work during that period, it was, I think, a special thing. We were seeing you kind of make the commitment to think about how can that continue to be, and how do we keep grappling with those things, even through a period where, the institutions that, would house sculpture in these certain ways, right, might be closed. So I'm wondering, as we kind of turn to the Black Atlantic, which of course is this very special exhibition that is running at the exact same time as Thomas J. Price's show, which I think is so exciting to have these two parts of history kind of fold into each other. If perhaps maybe you can talk about, in terms of Kiyan and Hugh, Hugh as a curator of this project, right, which is kind of amazing because you are also, of course, an artist and you're inside of this project in different ways. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about its inception, right? What gave you, some of the entry points to thinking about, bringing together these artists who hold these different perspectives, and also maybe to chat a little bit about, what is the Black Atlantic, right? How does that do something in particular to help us think differently about this question of the commons?
Well, given the opportunity to have this exhibition at Brooklyn Bridge Park with the Public Art Fund, with this materializing in the summer of 2020, I thought this was an excellent opportunity to use this as a stage, like the Brooklyn Bridge Park, as a park to show sculpture, I thought of the different lawns as galleries in a museum, and that this was a large amount of space that I felt that I would like to share this opportunity, to share the stage with other artists, with other sculptors, who I feel I'm in dialogue with, but also, sort of in the sort of spirit of like Black Lives Matter. And to some degree, I wasn't thinking that exact thought, but this opportunity to sort of present this exhibition that would provide a diversity of voices from different experiences that were connected by the African diaspora, but they all have their own voice, their own narrative, their own way that they use materials, the way they draw a line in the sand. And that it was important sort of to be having this exhibition at this particular point in history that is made up of sculptors from the African diaspora, that they all sort of reflected this like multiplicity or in this diversity that is reflective of the African diaspora, that there are artists from Africa, there are artists from Canada, there are artists from all over the United States, from different demographics and backgrounds, and that to some degree it's like questionable if the term Black needs to be in the show. However, because ultimately the works could be any sort of American or sort of anyone and be made by anyone in New York City. And so I think what's also great that it's in a park where people aren't paying admission to go in a museum. Many of the people who view the show have no idea what the identity of the artists who made the works are, and that they can actually, if they do choose to spend time with the work, there's this opportunity to sort of, as they might read one of the sort of wall texts, they might be transformed in sort of like what they immediately thought the work was about, then reading maybe what the artist's intent was.
Kiyan, what about you? And just thinking about, this question of the Black Atlantic, right? And maybe the ways that connects with some of the themes of your work, right? What are those histories? What are some things maybe that provokes?
Totally. I love the Black Atlantic, or like I think about it as the sort of framework to think through and consider a sort of collective, polyvocal experience that spans the Atlantic. So in my work, as an entry point, I look at or consider sort of experiences of Black folks on the East Coast. I'm thinking about folks in the Caribbean, and then now across the Atlantic in London, which I'm so glad we get to have this sort of transatlantic dialogue. But for me, when I was sort of considering these ideas in relationship to the exhibition, I was thinking about, okay, what are some of the like contributions that Black people across the Atlantic have sort of offered to the New World. And for me, that was really redefining what freedom is and expanding our notions of freedom globally. And that's how I sort of arrived at wanting to appropriate and reimagine this Statue of Freedom that might, that I would argue offers sort of a different notion of sovereignty than the one that I sort of observe through sort of a Black Atlantic lens.
I really appreciate that. And I want to maybe explore further this idea of sovereignty in relationship maybe to modernity. And I think that that's an important relationship, if only because the ways in which we define modernity, right, is actually so inextricably bound up in how Blackness has participated in it, contributed to it, driven it, right? But then also certainly too, Hugh, to your point, right, that there is a unique relationship between our understanding of a kind of American identity and modernity. And that how these things are kind of grappled with exists inside of some of the questions that we ask about what public can do. So Thomas, I'm wondering specific to bronze, it has a very complicated history. to say the least. And so I'm curious about the ways in which, you know, as you have thought about using this material, because, you know, you mentioned you started with plaster, right? And that's something that you were exploring. That has a possibility of disintegrating in a certain way, right? It can be something that can be broken quite easily if you can't really hug it, right? But when you put something into bronze, right, you don't come to play. And so I mention that because it is a very particular point, and I think it's useful too because, you know, bronze as a material has an art historical significance that's really, I think, something that's complicated, in addition to, of course, you know, its relationship to modernity. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, for me, the idea of using bronze was really to connect these fictional figures to the histories, the illustrious histories of museums, of the figures that we would see, you know, in cities, on plinths, you know, in London, down Whitehall, where the government resides, you know, pretty much. The people that we have been told are great throughout history, and suddenly there are figures who we haven't seen portrayed throughout history, really, in that sort of, in a natural sense. So really I wanted to play a game, essentially, with the viewer. I wanted to get the viewer thinking about, wait, where have I seen this before? Why haven't I seen this before? Because it wasn't until I installed the first public work that the significance of seeing black people presented in this manner in a very comfortable way actually had an impact on black people in the real world who saw themselves and could connect to a figure who wasn't. I think someone said it during an online talk. You know, the figure is reaching out. You know, they're not looking down on you, and I think it makes the viewer aware, and that's what I'm really trying to do with my work, which I basically consider as a catalyst. You know, I'm not saying that I can solve the issues about monuments. You know, I was making these kind of works about what it means to be human. These are humans who happen to be black because I was using my experiences. You know, when I was studying a predominantly white environment, the question, if it says, are there any questions, and the hands would go up, and be like, why do you only sculpt black people? And then all the hands would go down, you know? So this is the sort of the history that I've been working with. So it's really about, for me, bronze as a way to place these figures, these constructions, essentially, on the same platform in terms of materiality and value as these great leaders. I keep saying the words, but you know, so that we start to question our values as societies.
Because I kind of feel like someone might say, "Who is he?" or like a.
Which people have, and I thought it was so interesting, actually. And you know, I also want to just know, right? There have been moments of delight, like who is he? And then there have been moments where people have been, who is he?
Yeah,
right?
Like did he get shot, or is he dead, or like why he
and it's
gives
been
money?
really correct. It's been really interesting, like almost the disbelief, right, that we would have an ordinary figure in the world at a monumental scale, and the great delight, great challenges, great questions that have come out of it. So I think, you know, to that point, you know, what does it mean to create kind of these spaces where the ordinary actually is centered, right? Where actually perhaps it is not about, you know, encompassing greatness and having greatness be the focal point, but actually perhaps that it is just about the everyday. And I think as we were chatting in the green room, you know, the mention of the quotidian, right? Like thinking about what does it mean, right, to have a black quotidian? Can you maybe, Allison, thinking about, you know, how these things have intersected and
Sure.
the ways in which, of course, you're kind of curiously exploring these themes through the current exhibition and also, of course, through your immense work prior to arriving in New York. Talk about, you know, what is that black quotidian?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I wanted to point out something. I think language is so important, and the idea of greatness existing in some hierarchical relationship to quotidian. Perhaps we need to kind of reshift that.
Yes.
And also the idea of, you know, great people, like I realize, or great leaders, you were saying, and I realize that's, I think you're using that not in the way that perhaps.
I'm using it in an ironic kind of way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to play with language like that and also unpack it. For me, you're speaking directly to the exhibition that I curated at the Speed, where it was very much about having multiple conversations and really multiple stakeholders at the table and decentering myself as an authoritative voice. And part of that was really allowing for, and I even feel uncomfortable with that term of allowing, right? But creating space for the everyday, for people who perhaps didn't see themselves represented in the museum that was staging an exhibition around a person who is part of a community, who is not an art world person, who's not perhaps people who came to see Amy Sherald's painting had not come to the Speed prior or wouldn't necessarily see that as a space for them. And it actually is true. We had very limited visitorship. I think there were only about 40 tickets a day during the run of the exhibition, or 40 tickets a slot, some very small number, and 15,000 first-time visitors came to the museum. And so in thinking about the ways...
Allison, just to quickly back up, it's Amy Sherald's painting of whom?
Brianna Taylor.
Yes, this for those who, of course, are new to the work. Yeah.
Thank you. And so really developing an exhibition around this painting and thinking about how to call people into the space. You can see the image right now. This is what people saw when they walked into the galleries. They saw the portrait. And so if someone came to see the portrait alone, they would feel comfortable that they knew where they were going. And if they wanted to engage with the exhibition as a concept, they could also do that. But there were very distinct decisions that I've heard everyone tonight say they've also made in their work or in curatorial choices around a kind of situating of work that makes it more accessible. And so I don't want to get too far in the weeds about this, but it really was about having multiple conversations and decentering myself and really calling people into the space. And 15,000 first-time visitors to a museum is pretty impressive. So it was a team effort, but I think that we're all talking about these ways where we can allow people in.
Definitely, and Kiyan, to that point, I think it's great to talk about the materials of your work and push a little further there, because I think it does something very different, right, than thinking about what bronze does as a history, right? You oftentimes are working with organic materials, and for those who have not had the opportunity to see Kiyan's very recent solo project at the Hammer as well, it was very special to be able to see that, and also, of course, to be able to see the Black Atlantic on view here in New York, because, of course, it shows these different components of your practice. And I often am reflecting about the immense act of trust it takes for you to put these works that often are made with these organic materials into the public realm, right? Different than them existing in a white box space, right? Where perhaps there's an invigilator who's in the room, right? And thinking about the rules of the institution. There have been moments across your practice where you've really kind of taken that leap of faith and allowed for the public to really enter into that act of care with you and expect that of them. So can you talk a little bit about that, the ways in which maybe you've seen those things, and been surprised by them, and also perhaps too, right, where, perhaps there have been challenges within that as a practice, and thinking about how that pushes you further to consider really the relationship to the viewer and how we have to do the work to care for the piece.
Absolutely. The great thing about having a work in Brooklyn Bridge Park is that my studio is really close by, and so I occasionally will have lunch in the park and just quietly sit under a tree and people watch.
I love that.
And I mean, I've witnessed like kids climbing the sculpture. I get to witness the kind of sense of like disbelief of folks like trying to decode like how this piece made of earth is like existing in public at such a kind of monumental scale. And people attempt to like kind of decipher the material, the form. And I enjoy and welcome all of these various types of engagement, especially like the very physical encounters that people have with the work. I welcome folks touching and kids climbing the sculpture as a different way of like activating senses and using like not only just visuality to like try to make sense of or develop a relationship with an object, but because like I'm creating objects, I'm I'm interested in like that reciprocity, exactly. Yeah, that reciprocity. And so like having
They're not paintings or on a wall.
totally, and being in public allows that possibility, whereas like in a museum, there are like institutional rules that prohibit that, like people having that like level of intimacy with the work. And yeah, part of like me working with Earth is thinking about like the sort of historical and the social resonance with which it is imbued inherently. And so having people touch the work to engage with it in some ways, for me, also activates the material as this kind of living archive.
Absolutely. So I guess maybe I want to turn to a question that's a tricky question. Because, you know, we are, as was mentioned before, right, sort of a stone's throw away from Day's End, which is, of course, David Hammond's beautiful, incredible installation, kind of an anti-monument, you know, really paying homage to this idea of, you know, kind of the Matta Clark and architecture and, you know, how that cuts into the world, but also kind of rebuilds it entirely. And, you know, it really does bring up the question, right, are monuments meant to last, right? What does it mean to even have a fixed site or material? And so I'm curious if each of you maybe can reflect on this. Allison, I'm going to look at you, right, to get us started, because I can see that maybe you got a little something.
I have a little something. Well, I was lucky enough to live in New Orleans when 3 of the 4 major Confederate monuments were taken down, and it was a wild spectacle to see. And also just living in a space where there was a big culture of fear. The people that were taking the monuments down had to fully mask so they could keep their identities private for fear of retribution by organizations that felt that these monuments should live forever and ever and ever. And I don't need to name what those organizations are because we all know them. So I had this really, when I first got there, I was very like staunchly in a place of anti-monument, and then understanding a bit more about the nuance and idiosyncrasies. I'm still anti-Confederate monuments. That hasn't changed.
Good news, be clear.
For the record.
For anyone who was confused, you can leave now.
The question that I have around monuments, or this kind of occupation of space where monuments used to exist, is, do we want to occupy that space? Is that space a necessary space, right? And I think what these 3 artists are doing is something in dialogue but very different, namely because they're, as we said before, they have a different relationship to your body. There's not a plinth. There's not this kind of sense of revering a form because it's higher than you. So scale is really important. And I want to leave with a question for your question, which is, do we want to occupy that space?
Right. Other thoughts on that?
Well, I feel as if as artists we're remixing history, and we're sort of approaching different ideas in each of our work that are related but still somewhat different. Like somewhat my approach to materiality is I would never cast a sculpture in metal because I'm really sort of interested in like the cultural and historical and actual properties of the materials I use. So it would actually be, and also what the sculpture represents, it would be more about the piece actually weathering and deteriorating, sort of, and what that represents conceptually to this idea of what the Gulf Stream embodies. So that sort of it being erased is a good thing, but so by design and the materials I use, they typically operate on multiple levels that, cedar and oak are woods that can last a while outdoors. I didn't use pine, but at the same time, they can't escape the ravages of the sun and the weather because they are these sort of materials. But at the same time, in the notion of like, do monuments last, there is like, let's say thinking about the pyramids in Egypt, that they do spark wonder even though we don't know exactly what they represented. And so I'm curious about when something is sort of almost like erased, like what people, future generations think about what these things were. They're more like there's a wonder of like what they were, not really knowing exactly what they meant.
I think it's actually a beautiful prompt and inquiry. And I'm wondering, Thomas, if you want to maybe expand further, because to think about, right, like what it means to have when, we are all to some degree underwater and we are navigating the future Black Atlantics, right, and in our beautiful scuba suits, right, we will look to the sky and find that there will be this amazing figure that will still be standing, right? So I'm wondering what does that mean to you, right, to have these ordinary figures, right, really have, to some degree, like this eternal life?
I mean, I think there's a difference between a landmark and a monument, and I think there's a difference between a monument which recognises and celebrates an event, perhaps, or an unheard or unspoken story, to one which perhaps is whose only purpose is to reinforce a hierarchical sort of lie or situation, in terms of maintaining the status quo of inequality. So in that sense, I hope monuments like that aren't permanent. And I think we all make works which touch on monumental. As I said before, we're subverting or commenting upon. I make sculptures about statues. And for me, there's a very big difference between a sculpture and a statue. In terms of these ordinary people, I did the show in Toronto called Ordinary Men, which I think is, celebrating the ordinary. It's about us connecting to our own greatness and recognising it in other people. And I think the works that I make are about trying to connect to people. I've come from a practice where, I was doing performance, I was licking walls, and I went into a video, and now I'm using bronze. But it's
literally licking walls.
Literally, yeah. So that's not a British saying.
Wasn't a British saying, exactly. Yeah.
And so, there's been this journey about recognising the importance of material, recognising the importance of representation, and trying to challenge the sort of the fervent will of society at large to not want to change, or elements of society to not want to change the power dynamic. And this, for me, these works are all about power and value and trying to change that dynamic by making us aware of what exists and where we can go. So if, many, many decades from now, there is a flood, and it would be nice to know that people are still asking the question, who was that? And it wasn't of someone that was from historical, was supposed to be great. It was someone who connected us to our own greatness. So I think, in that sense, it's quite nice to make them permanent. If I start doing self-portraits, then maybe they'll be permanent. But I think, I like the fact that they're not of individuals. But none of my works are supposed to be permanent, apart from the one in Hackney about Windrush, which they decided they wanted to permanent. I'm not trying to say that any of these individuals should be there permanently.
I think it's important to maybe recognize and acknowledge that we're here because of the Studio Museum, right? And its incredible history running from 1968 to present. And to the point of what Harlem does in creating space for us to think differently about maybe Black futures. It's really, I think, an important maybe turning point within the different models of practice that each of you have spoken to this evening, because of the fact that we're asking questions about how those things maybe can be de-skilled, rewritten, reimagined, restructured, decolonized, right? And that actually those are things to the point of the pyramids, Hugh, which I so appreciate that as a comparison, which I think takes us almost into the future to look back at this moment right now, brings up so many questions about what is unknown, right? And actually aspects of what each of you are building in your practices is actually deeply informed by making a contribution to a future that is unknown and seeing, in that echo and exchange how things might grow from there. So, before maybe we turn to what I hope will be some questions from folks in the audience, I want to maybe conclude before we kind of pivot to, to think of this question about, how might we redefine monuments, right? How might we say that, it maybe is intended to do something that is specific to an audience that we imagine, a question that we're asking. I'm wondering if each of you might be able to, very briefly, of course, right, speak to that very chill question.
I mean, for me, the monument is really, in terms of maybe more monumental, it's about the impact. So, a monument can be small, a monument could be an action, but it's the impact it has within society and how that is transferred throughout people and what changes that leads to. So I guess if I'm making monuments, which I'm not, but if I were making monuments, it would be to try and create change. And I think the danger I have with my work when it's in the bronze format, in the large scale, is that it's mistaken for the thing it's critiquing. But that's a careful balance that needs to be negotiated. But yeah, I think for me, it's the impact that the work has.
And I would just follow it up by saying, I love an empty plinth. So the idea of absence has as much weight, perhaps, if not more, than presence. So I like this moment that we're in where there's lots of plinths that don't have monuments, and I'm still curious about that space.
Those are, I think, fantastic question marks, right? They're kind of asking us to think about what could be.
Yeah.
Well, to some degree, we've culturally, or the zeitgeist, we've moved away from monuments to a person, but more to movements, or also more people have a voice now than ever before. So there's a multitude of voices, and not just one person on a soapbox. So that, and all of our sculptures being on the ground, so many people have a voice now that it's not just, it's sort of, I wouldn't say, it's sort. I feel as if it's hard to say what the monuments of tomorrow will be. When Thomas, you were speaking, though, I was thinking about per se in the future, if you're the only person who's making these bronze figures now, in 300 years, people will say there will only be these sort of black figures.
They'll find a pair of Nikes just popping up, right? And they'll just start digging, what could this be, right?
Yeah.
And it's just this ordinary man, right? Kiyan, you want to maybe close us out?
You just invited me to dream of the future, which I'm actively doing, which I love. And I'm reminded of an image that I had recently in which I walked past an empty, or a plinth of a removed monument. And there were kids just chilling, sitting on it. And so I guess my answer is that I would love for the future of monumentality to be a continued site of creating sites where people, or sites of connection, of gathering, of vitality, of living history being actively created.
I appreciate that, and I also appreciate the kind of nuance between monumentality and monument, right? The ways in which, of course, Allison, we can be intentional with that in our language. But I would love at this stage to invite Dan Huff back to the stage to join us for this next portion of the conversation as we open up to Q&A. So welcome back, Dan.
Thank you.
We missed you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. This has been such a really thoughtful conversation, especially reflecting on the last 2.5, 3 years, where monuments have been such a point of contention and hot buttonness, and it almost feels like it's kind of subsided. And it feels important to actually bring it back because we still haven't figured it out. And the necessity of, in these murmurings, we are finding these new solutions always. And I want to open it up to if anyone in the room has a question for our panelists. That can include legacy, anyone up here. Also those who are joining us on the Zoom. If you have a question, we welcome that as well. And there are microphones in the room. If you do have a question, raise your hand.
There's a question over here.
I'd like to know when...
Oh, wait, hold on. Yeah, let's do the mic. Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to thank you for being here. I came all the way from upstate New York because I wanted to. I'm always inspired, and to me, this is monumental. How we live as a people, what it encompasses so much about the monumentality of who we are, and so I just had to be here. But I want to know, when did you know you were an artist?
I think that's maybe that question is an amazing question, and I also want to maybe like put a ring around it one more by asking, how do you even begin to imagine working at the scale that each of you work at, right? Because that as well is a part of this question of kind of when did you think about the fact that like it could even be possible, right? Because as you said, right, some of these things could be quite small. Working in studios, I remember Kiyan early visit with you, right, where it was like literally, could just be in one room. How do you fit all of these amazing figures and think about how that can occur and take a life on that exists beyond walls? So maybe can you talk a little bit about that, right? It takes a heightened level of imagination to build a pyramid, which I think each of you in many ways keep doing.
Well, I studied architecture, so one day could build a pyramid, but I feel like I grew up in a world where the sort of schools I went to, being an artist wasn't like a career path. I mean, there were artists, but they were dead, and so like for 200 years, and so it wasn't until I when I moved to New York and a few years out after graduating architecture school that I met an artist that was Derek Adams, and he was like the first artist who told me he was like just an artist, like he was full-time. I hate to even say full-time artist, but like because that means that like if you're part-time, you're not like a real artist. But I was working as an architect at the time, and I was like, wow, that was like I had ideas about the world that I didn't necessarily know there was a platform for, and that sort of started to like remix what my thought of what I could be, and that there was I had a voice that I didn't think there was an audience.
Other thoughts?
I mean, for me, it was quite early on. I had to recognize what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. I wanted to be lots of other things. So artist wasn't the first choice.
Can I put you on the spot? What were some of those other things? We're live.
Initially, I wanted to be a physiotherapist. So it's still about how things work and connections and kind of kinesthetic stuff. Then I almost made the choice of joining the Royal Marines back in the UK, which I probably never would have got through. But so artists, for me, it was a way of filtering my life and experiences through a series of experiments to connect to people. And that for me was like, yeah, that's the thing. How to do everything you love, and maybe ruin it actually, but turn it into a career. To do the things you love and to try and connect that to people and ask really difficult questions and sort of feel around and try and find answers, or get, if you're even more clever, get other people to answer the questions for you. So yeah, it just happened. But I never thought about being a full-time artist. I was doing loads of different jobs, but it's just about how do you keep making work? How do you keep making the experiments happen? And that was it really, And then you find yourself on stage talking to amazing people. So.
Kiyan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking it's a great question, a big question. And I guess I would first say that, or approach it by saying that, like, I knew myself to be an artist before I even knew of, like, entering or engaging with art as, like, a profession. And so for me, being an artist really is, like, a way of life, like a way of taking the ephemeral or the transient, an idea, and then, alchemizing and catalyzing one's sort of resources, but also imagination to render that tangible such that other people can experience something that you just conceive in your head. And I would I was doing that when I was like 16 or 17, before I knew that, again, that like one could have a life as an artist. I guess, so to answer the question, when, I was like a 16-year-old trying to figure out who I would be in the world, I harnessed my imagination to kind of figure out a blueprint. And that for me was sort of the first artwork that I made.
I just want to go back to the point you made about scale as well, just so I can. Yeah. Because that is a really interesting question. I think it's one that's often glossed over in terms of like how do you suddenly get to making large sculptures?
Yes, please.
Because it's not the easiest thing.
It's never occurred to me to try. Let's just say.
And I did start with smaller works, which were really looking at monumentality through the inversion of scale, so that people started to recognise the difference and then question, the things that they had in front of them. But it's a difficult process. And I think it basically, I find it so interesting because it really controls or it impacts who is making these large sculptures. Historically, like, you know, there's
privilege there, right?
This is what I'm talking about. Like, so the things that we recognize as monumental tend to be created by certain people in the world because they are the ones who've had access. In fact, you know, one of the sculptures that I made early on, you know, a young black man, believe it or not, people thought it was a white sculptor that made it because that's who makes big sculpture, you know, in their minds. So I think the fact is that this is changing now, and that we're finding different routes to access the ability to make these larger works, not because bigger is better, but because it does have presence in the environment and people do interact with it in different ways.
Well, yeah, people have a certain idea of who has access to certain resources, whether it's a table saw or in like doing wood carving.
But people actually did. This is the thing. Like, you know, different people did. You know, there was a very small group, I think, and particularly if you get into bronze, which is an insane material to work with, really, because it's.
I also just want to shout out the people that support the artists
100%.
that make these project managers, fabricators,
exactly,
you know,
curators,
curators.
Like,
well, I like the people that actually know
No,
how to do
agree.
this.
It's more than a village. It's more than a village.
It really is a village.
Yeah.
I have to say. I mean, working on this project was so interesting. I mean, because of course we were inside of the first part of the pandemic, and we were on phone calls, and I was holding up the phone, and it was not the right direction.
But it was your energy that brought this project through.
Oh, but I appreciate that deeply. But I think it's important for folks who are in the room to understand how many arms literally were inside of this, right? Like how many eyes had to kind of check everything. Like the process was so in depth. And there were, moments where, of course, as Thomas was not able to be in the room, which I think often can happen sometimes with fabrication, right? Folks sometimes are literally in the room, but also sometimes many distances beyond. And it's like, how do you narrate these things? You put these things into language that actually might, you might have never thought to even describe what it needs to feel like, right? So I think it's a really important point, to think about this idea of scale, how those things can grow, because it's about as well how you explain them to other people, and the support that comes with kind of collectively thinking through how do you turn this project into something that can exist in the world and be at a scale and have its impact with the public. So great question, and thank you for also traveling to be with us this evening. Are there other questions?
Wait.
Oh,
we got one on Zoom.
We got one on Zoom.
Yeah, we're gonna represent.
I love that.
So question, what do the panelists and artists think about instead of removing potentially offensive sculptures like Confederate Civil War leaders, keeping those monuments but installing another sculpture that shares the same space to present an alternative narrative that sparks debate, conversation?
Can I take this first?
Oh my gosh,
I feel like I'm coming in hot with this one.
I was going to say something, but this is your panel. Yes.
Absolutely not. Because the sculptures that are installed that are supporting these ideologies are hurtful, and the ideologies themselves cannot be couched in a kind of historical remembrance on a plinth. They belong in other places, but not in public space, because they're actually violent and they're representations of violence. So I don't. I think that's a...
I will just say, I want to go back to what Kiyan said, which is to kind of draw us into the imagination of the image that you kind of brought to the fore of having, some young folks sitting on one of these plinths, pedestals, right? I think that we've seen a lot of images of how these things have kind of been alchemized by the public, right? We've seen people drawing and painting on them. We've seen people sitting on them. We've seen people contesting them in all sorts of ways, right? So I think it's actually kind of an immense thing to think about the act of leisure, right? In terms of just sitting there and to be in exchange, and as well, right? The moments where I think people are just changing them into something altogether, right? And it's that trace that becomes the material. And to your point, Allison, right? Does that important work of kind of undoing some of what, has been harm set into the future. So, I think these are important negotiations that are very tender. And sometimes, to think about the possibility, right? The work becomes complete by folks coming into contact with it, right? And having that contact be something that perhaps can be empowered, envisioned differently.
By their removal.
I hear you.
I would add, as an artist, practically, I don't think I would be like interested in engaging in that kind of project of like creating an artwork that specifically is in response to a sculpture that really like embodies and represents like structural violence. So I feel like that proposition could potentially be a disservice to like an artist's imagination.
Right. It would be sort of cited in a wound, right? I appreciate
You're
that.
legitimizing
Right.
that history,
Right.
aren't you?
Right.
And you're basically being used as a way of maintaining that beacon of power from the past. And I don't think that's the way we want to go, is it? I mean, I don't want to go that way. I am interested in context. I am interested in creating a sort of dialogue. It depends on what it is. But I think it's a Confederate general that's, no.
Is there another question?
Thank you. Anyone in the room? Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Khalil. I'm actually an architect by day, artist by night. So I do have a specific question for Hugh. I went to Syracuse University, so we were number 2. You guys were number 1. We don't need to talk about it. It's okay. How has the pedagogy of architecture informed how you create? I mean, I see that you constructed or appropriated the construction of a body with a ship. That does look very architectural to me. But how would you describe, in your words, how the pedagogy of architecture informs your design practice?
Well, in the particular architecture program I went to, I think it kind of instilled in me it was sort of like a creative problem solving or reasoned way about thinking about design, and that while it might not be so evident in the final works that I'm making, but definitely that sort of rigorous approach to creating something, and that like the materials have a certain cultural, historical, physical properties and richness to them. Those are all things I think about. I would say as an architect, as now an artist, that a lot of the times the decisions I've made, things aren't necessarily by chance, but they might not be visible to the viewer. Like every decision that this wood is from a 200-year-old tree planted by the Afro-Mexican president of Mexico. Like you don't need all of those, like to know all of that, to understand the piece. So I think it can make it richer, or probably it also has affected my decision making. But I think also as the more I practice as an artist, I feel as I get more away from some of my architecture underpinnings of like the reasoning systems. But it's undeniable that that sort of decision making is like still there.
Thank you. I have another one from Zoom. Okay, we'll go in order. What historical literature on art history or monuments are you critical of or have shaped your contemporary understanding of how this kind of media monuments will evolve? How does this function with respect to decolonization?
Is that to me?
I mean, there's many places we could start, right? I mean, I guess I will not answer the question, but perhaps I will, frame it in thinking about, of course, Gilroy's text, Black Atlantic, and I do think that as a text is something that is informative in many different ways and threads itself through this conversation in a way that's really important because it brings together these questions of kind of Black consciousness and modernity and industry, right? Which I think are really important challenges within this idea of sculpture at all, right? And what it means to kind of create Black work, but also create American work and be a Black American inside of this site now, and also as well a diasporic Blackness that also travels from other sites, right? So, I think that's a text that might be an interesting one for folks to turn to, and then, I would be curious as well to hear some other good references that you all might be thinking of.
I have to be totally honest, I wasn't using references like that. I was really responding to what I saw around me in the world.
And that also is a text, yeah.
So yeah, it was society I was responding to, and my interpersonal interactions with people and the expectations or the lack of expectations that were placed upon me or projected upon me. and upon people like me, family members, friends. It was working my way through art schools that had a very limited understanding of what I was trying to speak to in terms of the personal experience that made me sort of find this route to materials, this route to scale as a way of questioning their values and their assumptions. And that lent itself to questioning the assumptions of a wider society and of government, essentially. So I can't say this text, it's about the world. And the real responses to the work I was putting out there. So that's why I talked about experiments before. For me, each of these works is like an experiment. They're a psychological experiment in response, in empathy. And I think we've lived in a world with a lack of empathy. And suddenly empathy is now a thing that we're talking about again, and it makes me so happy. But I was talking about it for years and nobody cared. And
it's ironic.
And so yeah, yes, the text is not something I've really relied on, but I think the lived experiences and responses and being sensitive to not zeitgeist, but to
I would even say it's also like having agency and not being tied to what someone says you should do or a text and needing to be able to back it up on this, but following your instinct, because like the hardest thing is like just saying I'm going to do this, and then finding a way to do it, because everyone holds a pencil slightly different. Your handwriting's a little different.
So the last thing you want to do as an artist is illustrate someone else's theory.
Yeah,
you're trying to look for your own thing.
Yeah, but it is curious, sort of like there is this like notion of like for the Black Atlantic show that it's like a global perspective, like everyone, and even on the stage, we're all coming from a different background. There's no longer no concrete blackness or like what an artist should be, what a curator should be, that we're more than ever, people today are defining who they want to be.
Right.
And so that carries through their work, that there is no text, there is no rule book, there's no like XYZ of how you should become the person or artist or work that you want to make, that really you can decide. And also, especially in the art world, a lot of it is just like, being the new iPhone, or like the thing that is like creating something new and different that reflects your individual perspective. I think that's probably maybe challenging to do, but at the same time, everyone is different. And so it's finding your own voice and like, materializing that and what the way that works best for you. Often just your access to materials will create a certain type of work because you didn't have, or for myself, because I didn't have a table saw or bandsaw, and I was using a dull pool saw, that created a certain way that wood was cut. And so then like building on that, so that not having access to certain resources isn't a handicap, it can create a certain like artist hand.
I want to offer Glissant's Poetics of Relation to this conversation, which perhaps is a text that helps us think about our relationship to others. It's slightly anti-monumental, and how one identifies their experience in the world or creates their experience in the world through relationship. And that's a really, brief, banal kind of paraphrasing of what Glissant is saying, but it's a very accessible text. It's a very relatable text, and that's what I would offer.
A text that I would also offer that really helped informed me in like my thinking around monuments, specifically in their relationships like history or rethinking history, is Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being. And there's specifically a chapter in which she, I don't want to misquote the text, but essentially is asking like, how do you create monuments to histories that are still unfolding and that continue to haunt the present. And so I remember revisiting that text and sort of thinking about, how do I create a work that proposes a different relationship to time that isn't rigid or fixed or linear, and that really helped animate my thinking.
I love it. We're adding to the curriculum.
I know.
It's beautiful. I think we have time for. Wait, say that again.
I love a syllabus.
Yeah.
Me too.
I think we have time for one more question in the audience.
Hi, thanks so much for everyone's contribution. Can you hear me through the mask?
Oh,
Okay. This question is kind of related to what you were just saying about glissant and the poetics of relation. This is for everyone as well, I'm curious to hear what you think. Do you consider monumentalism as a scale and a formal tool to be related to colonial logic? And if so, as artists and curators who are working to critique monuments, how do you deal with that relation in your own work?
Very good question.
It's a great question.
That's a really good question.
It's a great question.
I feel like I'm going to talk about that or answer your question in relationship to where I find myself working now, which is in public space in New York, right? So to compare it to perhaps a museum, in itself, the structure of it is quite monumental, right? So you might ascend a staircase. You might have to find the front door. You might then be confronted with your body in a space where you perhaps don't know what your body is supposed to be doing in that space, or if your body is afforded leisure in that space, right? Although there are challenges for all bodies in public space around safety and security, there isn't that relationship to monumentality. So by working specifically in public space, it hopefully affords a different kind of relationship for bodies as they think about how they might engage with artists' ideas. So
I appreciate that. And, as a curator, of course, who now is inside of an institution where being at the kitchen, the intersection between live work and performance, right, and object-based work is something that's really critical to the program's history. So we talk about this idea of the gray box, right? It's neither a theater, right, nor a white wall gallery, but it's something that exists in between. I think the thing that when you draw out aspects of each of your practices and you have the history of these works cited into the public realm, there's something that is inherently engaging, as you said, right? The public inside of a performance model, right? It asks people to react, to respond, to complete the work by spending time with it in a way actually that would be impossible if it was set apart from the public, right? So there is something that I think is really special about, the decolonial maybe proposition of that, right? It asks differently for there to be a somatic response to the work. That is part of its origin, right, and its strategy, how it's created. And I will say, of course, Kiyan, with literally the title of one of your works, right, it's Ruins of Empire. Okay, so, I think that in itself, right, does some important work to underscore, like, what are we contesting, right? And what are the ruins? What is the empire? Because I think those are things that maybe constantly seem to be shifting.
Absolutely.
And for me to break apart, for me what monumental means, maybe in this, that just a large sculpture isn't necessarily about monumentalness from a political perspective. Often in my practice, I'm more interested in scale as creating a visceral feeling that, like, often, I'm going to speak about my works because I'm most familiar with them, that, like, there you don't convey in a photograph or on Instagram or on a phone what it actually is like and embodied in person. And I feel as if monuments can sometimes be more of an idea, like a picture, but they don't fully capture the experience of engaging with something. And as an artist, I'm more interested in, scale as like another material that affects the overall experience of the work. And so sometimes that might necessitate something being large. It doesn't necessarily, and I think a great artwork can like co-opt that so that the piece, when people do experience it, it's not about some political or colonial, anti-colonial or post, that it actually is experienced for this visceral, feeling of how it transports you and makes you feel about sort of maybe the conceptual underpinnings of the piece.
Yeah,
So
I'd agree with that point massively. So I didn't talk about.
Oh no. Yeah.
But I think to go back to your point, in terms of, I mentioned before, like my concern was that the works I was making that were critiquing monuments would be mistaken for the statues that they're critiquing. But I think what I tried to do was use it as almost like a signal, like piggyback that signal that we're so sort of in tune with, that goes right into the core of something that we've been educated into understanding at a very sort of unconscious level, to try and snap us out of it a little bit and get us to think about these objects that are in society, in our worlds, that we sometimes walk past. We don't go, who is that? We sort of recognize who that is. There's almost like the lizard brain or something. There's the part of us just goes, oh, that's something to either ignore or something to worship, essentially. And I wanted to get people to say, who is that? Why is that there? You know, when I first started doing the works, people were kind of angry. Why is this person not standing up with chest out and looking proud? Why does that person look like me on an ordinary day? Why does this person look better than me? Because that's what we're used to. This person can go up on that plinth because they look better than me. You know, they look. And I think it's a really difficult balance to get. But I think it's an important one to try and do, because it's a stage. It's not like the ultimate thing. This is not going to solve everything. This is just a stage in getting to another point where we ask the right questions and take steps towards making different choices.
Thank you for that question. Do we have time for one more?
We'll do one more.
It's coming to you.
That's a lot of mics.
Hi, I'm an artist. I'm not an artist. Let me get that clear. I'm actually a nurse. I'm so happy here. I mean, I get high on life just taking care of my patients, and this has been exciting. It's been a while. My husband takes me out to play into a museum, so I'm grateful that my friend here, who is an artist, invited me to come. All of you touched different words and different things that actually touch me. And I know Kiyan did I say it right?
Kiyan,
yeah. Had said something, and that's what kind of like prompted me to actually say something. It's more of an acknowledgement and a statement versus a question. I admire all of you, but he said something that's like, I'm here, and I am I'm dreaming, I'm being motivated. The creative juices are coming, right, to be more creative. And that's a beautiful thing. Now, I came in here with my friend excited to come, but I didn't know I was going to get, the cake and the icing, all of it, all at once. Has been amazing to actually see, like you mentioned before, being grateful for all the positions that were created because of artists like you. Now, as a nurse, my whole entire life has always been about promoting health, empowering women, and young men and women to actually take care of themselves. And I use art into my presentations. And one of the things I've been doing for the last 10 years is really creating educational programs wherever I work. And I have used every material you guys, all of you mentioned, like the earth, like, just starting, like, the wood. I have pictures of a canoe in an ocean or in a river by itself, but facing the elements of the storms that you go through life. The monuments, the sculptures that you have created. And I was telling them that coming here, I didn't tell them where I got the picture, but a young woman who was in one of my patients was embracing one of your sculptures, the first women's sculpture that you created. And I used her picture with that. And it was powerful because it was talking about, remember who you are, where you came from, and don't let anybody else make you think otherwise. You said you wanted to be a physical therapist, but you actually are in creating your sculptures because they are all standing up straight, that powerful, that girl, that woman that is just like, no, she's not skinny, she's not, obese, but she's just like me. And that's what the patient told me. She looks like me. And I used that picture in my presentation, and it was so powerful. So I only have to say thank you to all the artists here tonight for actually just, having my creative juices going. And I will continue to use the pictures of the arts to be able to continue the message and really make them think about that. And that's a beautiful thing. So, and I thank you, all of you, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to express this, because
I know.
I'm not an artist, I'm a
note.
nurse, but I'm just...
Absolutely, it's a beautiful note.
I don't need to say say thanks, Hugh, because you just did it. You just did it better than I could. No, I think that's the perfect way of ending what has been a really significant year of exhibition for Thomas's piece in Marcus Garvey Park, and I appreciate the fact that it's going beyond just this physical space or that park, that it's continuing in all these other lives. It's beautiful. Legacy, thank you. Thomas, thank you. Allison, thank you. Hugh, thank you. Kiyan, thank you. Thank you here. Thank you on Zoom. This has been a really wonderful night. If you have time, Days Inn is across the street. Black Atlantic is in Brooklyn. Witness is in Harlem. I'm sure there's another public monument sculpture in your respective neighborhood. Go sit with it, linger with it, think about it, and just be out there. Stay well, stay healthy, stay sane if you can, because Mercury is still in retrograde. Thank you. Thank you.